Okay, welcome everybody. Lovely to see so many people here tonight. My name is Mike Savage. I'm Professorial Research Fellow here at the LSE's International Inequalities Institute. It gives me a huge pleasure to be chairing this really exciting event. I'll introduce the panelists in a minute, but I should say, I have spent much of my academic career working on social class and thinking about class and why class matters and why we cannot ignore the issue of class in terms of how it affects people's political views. So it's really wonderful to have this expert panel reflecting upon these issues. And I'm sure all of us recognize, looking at the political tumult of 2026, just how much the issue of class and race is playing out in the UK as in other nations. I was very struck listening to the speech of Hannah Spencer after winning the Gorton and Denton by-election, how she was talking about working class communities, which was an interesting indication, I think, of how the issue of class and along with race is really playing out. So this is a really, really timely event we're holding tonight, and it is sparked off by a paper which was written by John Denham, Sam Taylor-Hill and Tariq Madood, who's in the audience here, called Multicultural Nationalism, Saving the White Working Class from Blue Labour. That is available. Don't read it now, but you can download it and read it at home at your leisure. And so what will happen is John and Sam will present the key arguments for 20 minutes or so. And just to introduce them, John Denham is Professorial Research Fellow and Director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics at Southampton University. He's also a very experienced Labour politician. He was a Labour MP from 1992 to 2015, where he served as a minister under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's cabinet, where he was community secretary. So he has academic and real-world political experience to talk about. Then we have Sam Taylor-Hill, who is programme manager of the Orwell Youth Prize, the IR Teaching Associate at University of Bristol, and author of Challenging Alienation in the British Working Class, Building a Community of Equals. So John and Sam will talk for 20 minutes to introduce the arguments and the key ideas. And then we will have two discussants. Sara Hobolt is one of Europe's most well-known political scientists, the Sutherland Chair in European Institutions, also head of the LSE Department of Government. So we respect and appreciate how busy you are and how you found time to come tonight. In her forthcoming book, Tribal Politics, How Brexit Divided Britain, she examines how the Brexit vote gave rise to new political identities in Britain. And finally, Anand Menon is Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London. He's a Director of Public First and directs the UK in the Changing Europe project, very high profile centre, which has had a lot of media attention and has established itself as the leading source of impartial research based on evidence on the UK and its relationship with the EU. So Sara and Anand will have about 10 minutes each. We hope to finish the presentations by 4:07, and that should give lots of time for discussion and questions from the floor. So it's going to be a terrific evening. Let me pass on to John.
Sam, go first one.
Okay, Sam. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I will just begin kind of by giving a little bit of context to some of these terms, really, starting with multicultural nationalism. So, as some of you may know, the best known political theory of multiculturalism is that of Will Kimlicka, often described as liberal multiculturalism or sometimes liberal nationalism. It is grounded in a liberal conception of citizenship. So that means not only that individual autonomy is treated as the highest good and therefore the ultimate justification for multiculturalism, as for any politics, but also that politics is understood primarily in terms of rights. That is individual rights, political representation, self-determination, and the rule of law. So kind of the classic liberal conception of things. And Kimlicker's distinctive move is to supplement those individual rights with group differentiated ones as well, therefore becoming a liberal multiculturalism. There is, however, an alternative political theory of multiculturalism, which is what we're drawing upon and what we drew upon in the paper. And this approach sees multiculturalism less as a theory of autonomy and more as a political ethics of citizenship, an ethics concerned with reconciling minority identities with civic solidarity and the national identity as well. And this has come to be known as the Bristol School of Multiculturalism, which is associated mostly with Tarek, amongst others. And one important difference, I should say, is that the Bristol School is built on a stronger conception of equality than what is found in liberal citizenship. And equality here is not just about equal rights, it's about equal belonging, about citizens being able to see themselves and be seen as equally part of the national political community. And this produces what has been called a thicker citizenship. It's not grounded only in liberty and equality, but also in solidarity, the third term in the kind of Republican triad, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And the argument is that only a strong sense of membership in the polity, of belonging to La République, if you'd like, can generate the sense of what citizens owe to one another. And that mutual sense of obligation is the basis of an egalitarianism robust enough to allow minorities to demand recognition of their differences while still holding the nation together. So on this view, multiculturalism becomes the right to a subgroup identity that is treated in an equal citizenship way. So minorities are not asking for privileges, they're asking for their identities and group needs to be taken into account in shaping the polity and the national identity, in the same way that the majority's language, customs, history, and religion already shape both citizenry, culture, and the state. And it is on the basis of civic membership that minorities can demand recognition, not only of what they share with others, but of how they differ as well. And for the Bristol School, recognition is not merely symbolic. It must also be institutional. That might mean a national curriculum that reflects minority histories and religions, not just those of the majority. And it means remaking citizenship and national identity so that, for example, Black Britons and Muslims are understood to be as fully British as anyone else. And the progressive construction of this kind of inclusive multicultural nationhood therefore becomes the goal, hence partly the title of multicultural nationalism. And it's crucial as well to emphasize that such recognition, whether symbolic or institutional, local, national, is not a concession or a compensatory right. It is part of being a full member in that national community. And the position has more recently been described as multicultural nationalism, with the further argument that recognition must be mutual and dialogical. Recognition, in other words, cannot only flow one way. An egalitarian ethic of citizenship cannot mean that one group is always the giver and another always the receiver. All citizens are potential givers and receivers of recognition, particularly as misrecognition and marginalization can affect any group, including, for example, the white working class. And if certain identities matter to their bearers, we work from the premise that they must be respected by co-citizens and the polity itself. So multicultural nationalism is therefore built on national citizenship and national identity, but insists that this identity must be made inclusive. It requires institutional accommodation of minority, ethnic and religious needs. It requires remaking the public space and national symbols so that all can kind of see themselves reflected. And that is a long way from the claim that Britishness must be deconstructed. It is not about dismantling national identity, it's about thickening it, pluralizing it, transforming it over time through inclusion. And here the contrast with liberal nationalism becomes clear again. So Kimlicka argues that liberal states tend towards a thin conception of national identity, a minimal kind of common culture designed to allow individuals from diverse backgrounds to integrate as equals. Multicultural nationalism moves in the opposite direction. Rather than thinning that kind of public culture, that common culture, it calls for a pluralistic thickening. Excising racist elements, yes, but otherwise expand in national identity so that minority identities become part of its very substance. So in short, it's a project of ongoing inclusive nation building. And we've kind of been developing this in relation to this kind of change that has occurred within Britain, within England specifically. That's what our article kind of addresses, that's been going on over kind of the last, several decades. So rather than a cohesive and dominant majority kind of confronting a clearly bounded minority groups in contemporary England, we can probably better understand it as being a place that is fragmented. We do live in a plural society, and we contend that the very idea of a stable majority is itself changing. Before we can understand the experiences of the white working class, we therefore need to situate them within these kind of broader transformations. There's a few kind of statistics and things there on the slide, but I'll speak to a few kind of different changes just to kind of give a broad picture of what's kind of been happening. So over the first quarter of the 21st century, England has become significantly more diverse. The proportion of the population identifying as white fell from 91.3% in 2001 to 81.7% in 2021. And given that the 2021 census took place during a period of record net migration, much of it from outside of Europe, diversity today is likely to be even greater. Of course, racism has certainly not disappeared. People who are not white remain significantly more likely to experience discrimination and disadvantage, even if racism is perhaps less oftenly overt in our public settings and more visible on social media. Yet it's no longer accurate to equate whiteness with a coherent and culturally unified majority either. So, for instance, England is far less religiously unified than in the past. So the century is kind of a common frame of reference for people and their identity. Now, only around 46% of the population identifies Christian, while more than a third say they have no religion at all. And the influence of the Church of England has declined quite considerably, and some of the most dynamic Christian communities are now found amongst recent migrants. Similarly, within the white population itself, we find both the most strongly liberal and strongly reactionary values. And more broadly, outside of kind of cultural markers, confidence in national institutions has weakened. So younger generations are less likely to view the monarchy as legitimate, and only around half of Britons say they take pride in how British democracy works at the moment. Even the NHS, which is still widely valued, faces declining confidence in its performance. But at the same time as we're seeing this, we're seeing the meaning of the majority broaden. So former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the current Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, both draw on very kind of traditional accounts of the national story, demonstrating that race alone does not exclude individuals from one expression of majority culture. And while the majority may be expanding, we argue that it's also fragmenting in some ways. So white ethnicity alone no longer guarantees a sense of belonging to that kind of majority, that political mainstream. And a key example of this is the white working class, whose grievances increasingly reflect the experience of a group that perceives itself as excluded from the contemporary majority. And at this point, I'll pass over to John to kind of talk more about this.
Sam, thank you very much. And thank you, Mike and Sarah and Anand, for coming this evening, for you all for coming. So let me pick up where Sam has got to. Sam has begun to describe a white working class that experiences alienation, but is also rarely accorded agency. It's talked about, but not given a role in determining its own future. But what is this white working class? We have to acknowledge that not everybody is comfortable with the term. And it varies. In education studies, for example, when people talk about education of white working class kids, that is both recognized and almost always situated in the experience of working class communities. But in other areas of academia, it's more controversial. Some question whether the white working class exists at all distinct from the working class as a whole. Some will argue that it is a politically created category for malign purposes. And others will say that even if the white working class does exist, we should be cautious about talking about it too much for fear of playing into the hands of those malign people. We would argue, however, that national populism of the form that we see in Reform UK would not have been able to mobilise the white working class if it didn't reflect some social reality. And it's certainly true that you can't define the working class, white working class, by one socio-economic or demographic indicator, but, and I can't go into detail tonight, but we would argue that there are parameters that provide the boundary of a recognisable fraction of society. Fuzzy boundaries perhaps, but rather like describing the elephant, you recognise it when you see it. So just to touch on that briefly, geography, communities that are predominantly white and overrepresented in former industrial and coastal areas and in large cities, but where there is limited interaction with other groups. The white working class's experience of diversity is less than other people's in our current society. They feel a strong sense of identity with place, but not the ability to shape the future of the places in which they live. Their education, their employment, they are on education much less likely to have participated in higher education or to aspire towards it. Employment is concentrated in lower status, insecure work, although there are also self-employed, non-university successful tradespeople doing relatively well. Their economic attitudes tend on the traditional measures to be left of centre, supporting redistribution and public ownership, but as you will know, they are more socially conservative. Low social status in their minds correlates with authoritarian preferences. Their identities are distinct, often combining an emphatic Englishness with a deep and very patriotic British identity. They are English and British, not English rather than British. They have a distinct view of the nation, putting a much higher value on national sovereignty and national decision-making than others, which is why they played such an influential role in the Brexit decision. But they also have a low trust in political institutions. Their weak sense of their own political efficacy leads them to be distrustful of politicians and of elites and wanting radical change to the system. And although in this group in society, their attitudes towards immigration have actually liberalised over the last 20 years, they remain the most immigration sceptic part of society. Having said all that, we also need to avoid a crude caricaturing of the white working class as uniformly right-wing, badly educated, economically marginal, prejudiced bigots, just as talking of the Muslim community flattens a vast range of diversity under a single characteristics. So attitudes within the white working class are more nuanced and diverse at an individual and at a community level. And we think it's important to stress that, as far as we can see, while being white conditions their life experience and is part of who they are, whiteness is not of itself of great importance to the white working class. And we can see that, amongst other things, from the consistently falling numbers of people, now very small numbers of people, who insist that Englishness or Britishness must be white identities. Now, in the questions, you can challenge whether this description of the white working class stands up or not, but if you'll bear with me, I'd like to move on to the, as it were, the last part of the presentation. Because the question this raises, building on what Sam has said, is, are there lessons that we can learn from multiculturalism to give a recognition in a diverse society to the white working class? Multiculturalism gives us three tools to address inclusion, established long before this current debate. Acceptance, we know you are here. Recognition, you have a right to be heard. Symbolic inclusion, you should be able to see yourself in representations of the nation. Those tools have been very important in the moves that we have made towards a multicultural society, and they've been strengthened in what Tariq Madood calls multicultural nationalism, with its emphasis on an expansive and shared sense of the nation. So if we were to apply this to the white working class, firstly, acknowledging that the working class exists as a distinct fraction of society, instead of questioning whether it does or should, or even if it does, we shouldn't talk about it. When you do that, you recognize a set of experiences, worldviews, understandings of themselves that have as much right as anybody else to be heard within our society. Recognition would change some current practice. When we consult, do we take as much care to engage with the white working class as we would like to think happen, though it doesn't always, with faith and ethnic minorities? When we do set priorities, do we accept that taking educational disadvantage, for example, requires engagement with the whole community and its challenges, not just with schools? As I said earlier, educationalists generally get that, but not all political discussion about the performance of white working class kids does. Sorry. Do we give agency to the white working class, or do we make policy for it? Look at the way we do growth policy and regeneration. Do we sustain the unions and civic society organizations that might empower people? Do we recognize history? Do we slightly sneer at backward-looking nostalgia, or do we work to capture and understand where that nostalgia for lost place in the world comes from? Because unless we do that, it will be harder to engage people in a discussion of the future. Does the white working class have a position in the culture of the nation? Now, there's some recognition recently of the exclusion of working class talent from theatre and the arts, but if you forgive a local anecdote, when Southampton developed its City of Culture bid, it recognised all the city's diversity, but not that of the white working class within a post-industrial city. Symbolic inclusion in the nation raises the question of which nation. As I mentioned earlier, the white working class in England tends to be emphatically English and also strongly British. Britishness is no longer a unifying identity across Britain or even within England. So the shared national identity in England must include ideas of England, not just of Britain. So we think we could use those tools of inclusion developed for multiculturalism to include the white working class within an expanded shared national story. Let me end, though, just with three further comments. I think we need to recognise that those who reject the idea of a diverse society will put themselves outside this project. But that doesn't render it invalid. We're already used to the idea that multiculturalism does not embrace some minority views that also run against the values of liberal democracy. Second, I think we would argue that although we would like to see multicultural nationalism as a project of both state and civic society, it isn't a project of state and civic society at the moment. The government just published its cohesion strategy yesterday. It is silent entirely on the question of nation building, argue it's silent on the question of multiculturalism per se. Even in the absence of that strategy, and we do need that inclusive strategy because quite clearly many minority groups do not believe they are recognised, accepted and included at the moment. So this cannot be something just for this section of society. Even without it, we think our politics would be better by this recognition of the white working class. And the provocative title of our first paper, which was critical of blue Labour, we think that's a suboptimal way of trying to include people in the politics and one that has far too many dangers. And thirdly, on the question of class politics more generally, we would like at least to speculate that including the white working class explicitly in the story of the nation makes a genuine cross-community class politics more likely rather than less likely, and that would be beneficial. That's our argument. Thank you for listening and listen to this. Look forward to the responses and to your questions. Thank you very much.
We're brilliant timekeeping and really clear get the ideas out there. So, Sara, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. I mean, and first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I will encourage all of you who haven't read the article in full or who's beautifully explained. To read it, it's a really great piece of work. And one thing I thought was interesting about it, that when you read it now, even though it was probably written over a year ago, it's more relevant than even then. So it's definitely, defining issue of our time in British politics. So what I wanted to do was not sort of any sort of normative perspective or theoretical perspective criticize this idea of multicultural nationalism, which I think is very appealing in many ways. But thinking that if I got the job of that, Morgan McSweeney left behind, and I was thinking, is this going to be a successful strategy for Labour? And here I don't mean should that be part of what they believe in, but should that be at the very forefront of the general election campaign? And if so, would that be the way to take them from wherever they are in the polls to where they want to be? And so I wanted to give, in a sense, two pieces of kind of potential warning for saying, I'm not saying that's what you're trying to do, by the way, but if that was to say that should really be Labour, should we go into the next election saying what we should really focus on is multicultural nationalism. So two arguments for why that might be risky for Labour, and then one piece of evidence for some research I've done recently. So the first argument is about the mobilizing nature of identity. So we know, of course, that this is important for political parties. It has been very important for the Labour, for the social democratic movement in all of Europe, the working class versus, the other side, the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And we know that political parties are very successfully make group appeals to certain identity and mobilize and persuade on that basis, meaning, we represent you. We also know with Labour that, of course, that has become a lot less certainly prominent in their appeals, with the rise of New Labour and so on, that these group appeals are not there to that extent. Now, of course, the nationalist group appeals that are used, the ethno-nationalist or even white nationalist group appeals used by the populist right or the radical right or the far right, is also very successful in mobilizing the white working class that you talk about again here in Britain and across Europe. And so what is it that makes these appeals successful? And I think some of it is, of course, what you describe is that you feel part of that group, you feel included. But my challenge to you is that you're not discussing so much the other part of the mobilizing force of social identity, namely the exclusion. So it's not only about who you are, it is also about who you are not. So it is also about that we belong to an in-group, but we also identify who is the out-group. And particularly when it comes to giving that boost in your self-esteem, addressing these grievances that you describe beautifully of the white working class, the relative status loss that they feel. What is it that the ethno-nationalist, the nativist appeal give them? That is, they address these relative status loss by saying, maybe you're not doing that well economically as you feel you should. Maybe you're not being heard by the political system, but at least you're better. You have a higher status than these other guys. Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating it here, but there's a power. But there's a power, in social identities, in not just the in-group, but also the animosity towards the out-group. And in that animosity, you get that boost, that self-esteem for knowing that, at least on some dimensions, you're better than someone else. And so for my first challenge is that simply focusing on inclusion, are you missing that political force of social identities, which there was also in the working class appeal, that it's not just who you are, it's also who you're not and who the outgroup is and why you want to, beat them or feel better on them on some dimension. So that's my first challenge is when without that element of inclusion and the element of addressing the relative status loss of the white working class through the idea that there is an outgroup that on some dimension is worse, how are you then addressing those grievances? My second point is about whether or not identity appeals at all should be a central campaign strategy to Labour. So even if we say, yes, we think multicultural nationalism should be a part of it, should that be at the forefront of their electoral strategy? Is it strategically advantageous for Labour to make identity politics, cultural politics at the heart of their electoral fight back? And here I think there is again an inherent danger. And the reason for that is that the electoral coalition, as you again described very accurately, has been about the electoral coalition between the white working, or generally the working class that is part of the electoral base, but also the growing and growingly important, people like us basically in this room, the sort of urban, professional, the electoral coalition between those two groups that, as you described, on cultural issues have very different views. Where they are similar in their views is on issues of redistribution. It is on issues of believing in public service delivery and a welfare state. So this is where a university lecturer and someone belonging to, as you described, the white working class can agree. We want an NHS that works. We want a certain level of redistribution. We want a public sector that works. We believe in a level of taxation that can deliver that. And that's both in terms of the holding together that coalition, is where Labour has traditionally, and social democracy more generally in Europe, been successful. So looking at the existing coalition, but also where they have what political scientists like to call issue ownership or an issue advantage. In other words, when people think about the NHS, or they think about employment figures, or they think about a well-functioning welfare state, then they will generally think probably this is something, it's credible that Labour will care about it and do something about it. And that is, so what Labour or social democratic parties want to do is when people enter that ballot box, they want them to think about those issues. Bracket here, not of course if you've just been in government for a long time and messed it up, but in general, it is to Labour's advantage to focus on the delivery in areas where they're seen as credible, as caring, and as strong, as competent. Now, when it comes to issues of cultural identity politics like migration, and I think for a lot of people, when you say multicultural, you do think about issues around migration. You have two problems for Labour. First of all, the first problem is you have these very diverse views of their electoral coalition. And the second issue you have is that if that is what voters think about when they go into the ballot box, they're going to think, well, if I'm a part of the electoral coalition that thinks there are too many immigrants, or I'm worried about my community around me not looking like I think it should, or I think it did in the 1950s or whatever, and who do I think is really credible, I'm going to do something about it. It's not going to be Labour. So that's the one concern. Is that what Labour wants to be the defining issue of an election campaign? So I think a lot of politics today is not just about the policy positions you take, but what are the issues that are salient when people make up their mind? And I think there's a danger for Labour if they were to, and again, I know that's not necessarily what you argue, but if they were to make multicultural nationalism the central plank of their electoral strategy, that they would take away from where they have their natural electoral advantage, which is in redistributive politics, which is in public service delivery and issues around employment. And so these were my 2 points. So my final argument is then about recent research I did around Starmer's Island of Strangers speech. So I think you would think that is not the embodiment of multicultural nationalism. So in a sense, it's not an argument. In a sense, you could see this empirical research as, in favor of your argument, but just to illustrate. So what happened? So this was rhetorically, if not in policy terms, certainly a shift that was seen as a shift to the right on immigration. It wasn't particularly inclusive. As a migrant in this country, I didn't feel particularly included, certainly. And I imagine other groups may have felt even less included, but that be what it may. And in this Island of Strangers speech, I guess the strategy behind it, if I was going to sort of think of a strategy, would have been to say, oh, we are with you, these white working class voters who care about immigration and think there are too many, we understand you and we hear you. Well, what we saw in our research when we did a sort of experimental design, what we saw in our research was two things. First of all, and that goes to my second point about saliency. What happened is that voters who were exposed to that versus the ones who hadn't been exposed, they all of a sudden felt that immigration was really a big problem. Yeah, of course, like even our prime minister tells us it's terrible, it's really a big problem. The other thing that happened, that the part of Labour's coalition who don't think immigration is a big problem were like, what the hell is going on? We actually don't like Labour or Starmer as much as we did before. So they alienated one part of their coalition, and it's not like they attracted the other part, because the other part was like, okay, immigration is more salient. And again, we didn't find evidence necessarily that people then went to vote for reform, but we certainly didn't find that those voters who were concerned about immigration were now, oh, Starmer is now our man. Again, because he's maybe not the most credible person when it comes to being the most anti-immigrant of all the politicians we have. So, would a multicultural nationalism speech have done the trick, I guess is the question. I think it probably would have done less damage, but I still think that my arguments, I still would be concerned about those two arguments. Would it address the grievances on the basis of just being inclusive and not exclusive? And would it in fact increase the salience of an issue where a Labour doesn't have a natural electoral advantage? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Some penetrating questions there, which we'll ask to reply for in a minute, but let's move on to Anand first.
I mean, this is quite boring because I kind of agree with everything. It's a really interesting article and it's well worth reading. I mean, I will challenge it a bit in a minute, but I also agree wholeheartedly with Sara in the sense that this is not terrain Labour wants to be anywhere near the public and near voting boxes at the time, which applies both ways, I think, both having an open debate about what sorts of multiculturalism you want to embrace or trying to out-reform reform. They're both basically losing strategies for Labour. Labour needs to be fighting on different electoral terrain. But happily, and this is where I come, I suppose, to my critique of the paper and the presentation, what is electorally right is also, I think, good public policy, because I think actually the way to deal with the issues confronted by the white working class is not to create a new political theory of multiculturalism, is to deal with the issues that lie at the heart of this fight. And those issues are economic, largely. This is not for a moment to say that there aren't specific issues affecting the white working class. I've got a text from a nephew of mine who's at UCL saying you're going to some event where you're going to feel sorry for white people, are you? There are specific issues affecting the white working class. There's a commission on the white working class at the moment that is doing some investigations into educational outcomes. And if you go to their website and look at the educational outcomes, they are eye-wateringly dreadful. On many other indicators of deprivation, then actually white working class do a lot better than other members of the working class. And in general, I'm one of those people that say, for working class people, there's more that unites you, just whatever your colour, than there is that divides you, actually. And attempts to divide you are generally a ploy of the populist right. But on educational outcomes in this country, we do have a specific problem. We also, I think, have a specific problem when it comes to the white working class in the way they are talked about. I never cease to be amazed by the way, even in the sort of so-called respectable press in this country, white working class is used as a shorthand for racist oik. The red wall is used in that way over and over again, and it really is a form of snobbery that we should grow out of pretty damn quickly. So I'm not for a moment saying there aren't specific problems associated with the white working class, but it seems to me that a lot of the attitudes that are sort of touched on in the political quarterly argument, the political quarterly article is an article about what Labour could and should be doing about the working class. The core of the kind of attitudes and the drift of these populations away from the Labour Party, for me, lie in 40 years of economic neglect. I mean, it's as simple as that. We have created a situation facilitated by a voting system that trapped people in this binary choice where it was one or the other and there was no real choice, where we could just ignore parts of the country, sections of the population. It is an absolute absurdity that in a Britain at the start of the 21st century, geography should be destiny, but geography is destiny in this country. There was something interesting in the Financial Times a couple of months ago that basically said a working class kid in London has more chance of going to university than a middle class kid from Blackpool. We've let parts of the country rot. We've let sections of the community rot. We've been happy to not think about providing jobs with prospects, a degree of pride for working class communities. And guess what? After decades of this, they're a bit hacked off. They're losing faith in the political mainstream. They're losing faith in Labour politicians who are meant to represent them. They're losing faith all the quicker, of course, because they see precious few working class people in Parliament. I mean, this is something else we ought to think about. We touched on the issue of representation in your presentation. Parliament used to include a good proportion of working class people. There are virtually none now. The vast majority, I can't remember what proportion it is, but you know, the vast proportion of MPs are university graduates now. So these are the kinds of things for me that we need to be focusing on. And that economic issue is the prism for so much else. I spent 2 days in Merthyr last week doing a series of what we call immersive interviews. So basically it means going around confronting people and talking to them about what they think about community and politics and stuff like that. What was very, very clear was their antipathy towards immigration was based on economics. It was based on access to public services. It was based on school classrooms being overcrowded. It was based on scarcity. It wasn't based on culture, as the populist right would have you believe. It wasn't based on some innate fear of different religions or whatever. It was based on economic scarcity. The more people there are, the less there is to go around. So I think for me, however interesting it is in the classroom to have this kind of debate, I would hate to see Labour having it now, because I think Labour has more pressing things that it ought to be getting on with. The other thing I think that is an issue for a lot of these communities, and again you touched on it, was the issue of control or autonomy. And here I think, you know, Labour spoke in bold terms in opposition about a take back control bill which would devolve significant political and fiscal power over the regions and the cities. We've seen precious sign of that ambition being translated into reality as yet, but I think it is incredibly important. You've got to be cynical. It's quite a useful backstop against a reform government if you do an awful lot of power away from London. But in more functional terms, actually, I think people feel that power in this country is too remote. I think ultimately, if I look at the Labour Party and its position vis-a-vis the working class now, I think the ultimate failure, and this is a failure over decades, it's a failure that goes back to Brown and Blair actually, is that Labour has not in recent times convincingly, effectively and systematically made the case for social democracy. The Labour Party should be out there making the case that a more equal society where people aren't left behind is a better society for everyone in terms of outcomes across the board, whether they're health, whether they're crime, whatever they may be. And I think, you know, this might sound awfully old-fashioned, but ultimately get the economics right. Make the case and win the argument for a social democracy that doesn't accept that regions or people should be left behind in the way they have. And then actually you'll deal with these problems far better than coming up with a new concept of multiculturalism.
Before we open it up, do you want to respond to?
Yeah, I think that's a few short points.
Yeah.
Firstly, I feel guilty on behalf of my co-authors because when we wrote the political quarterly piece, we were going to call it multiculturalism and the white working class. And I said, no, let's call it multicultural nationalism, saving the working class from blue Labour. More people will read it. Well, actually, it was one of the best read articles in political quarterly last year, largely because of the title. But it wasn't actually a political strategy document for the Labour Party. It was actually saying the response to the white working class represented by blue Labour, which is essentially to appeal to its most reactionary characteristics, is disastrous politics for a political party. But I think we would say that, if you like, the theory we put out here is actually one for society, right? Not for the Labour Party. Second point, so I think there's a very fair criticism. And as a sort of Labour Party person still, I would not necessarily advocate foregrounding this particular issue above all else. What I would say briefly is that Labour does not have a convincing story about the type of nation it's trying to create, and that the divisions, the tensions, the arguments over the allocation of resources, who gets listened to, are exacerbated because there is no convincing national story which includes everybody within it. And I would argue that although I entirely understand and agree with getting the economy right and delivering and doing the rest of it, social democracy ultimately rests on having a society in which there are reciprocal rights and obligations, contribution and recognition. And actually, without a convincing story of the nation you're trying to create, the consensus for, as you said, Sarah, high levels of taxation, decent welfare state is harder to build. So I would certainly, and I'm speaking for myself here, that's not necessarily my colleagues, actually, this is a crucial part of creating the circumstances in which a strengthened social democracy can arise. And so I don't agree with the deliverist view. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but there's quite a lot of debate about deliverism in the States and here on the left. I don't believe you can deliver and therefore avoid these questions. I think actually tackling these questions makes delivery more feasible because you have the political consent. But that's my own view briefly. Sara, if you want to add it.
I mean, yeah, I would agree with everything that you've kind of said there. No, I think it's useful as well just to kind of mention that the idea of multicultural nationalism is that we're taking an ascribed identity. So people have labelled them the white working class. And what we're trying to do is enable the group to assert their identity kind of from the inside. So they might, a lot of people that are white and working class wouldn't label themselves as white working class, they'd label themselves as working class. And just as kind of in, say, the 1980s, where the category of black was used basically as a shorthand for kind of non-white, what multiculturalism did there was enable those minorities to kind of speak, to choose and, you know, describe identities that were more meaningful for them. So, you know, that might be Muslim or British Muslim. And so the white working class is a little bit different in some cases. But I think what we're also trying to do is kind of present an argument that gives them that agency, which hopefully is also less divisive in its outcome than, you know, what the populist right are seeking to do.
And what if I build on that? What's to play for is not the group of people who are so strongly ethno-nationalist. There is no way they are reconcilable with a diverse society. That is beyond this project. I don't see how that works. What is to play for is a much larger group of people for whom that is not automatically the way they see their position in society. But unless recognition is given to them, are more prone to go to people who want to define it in ethno-nationalist terms. So it's a way of actually trying to include the largest group of people.
Okay, should we throw them to questions from the floor? And I suggest we do it in factors of three to get some questions on the table and then ask the speakers to respond. And if you can ask questions to all the panel, it's not just Sam and John. So when you introduce yourself, please to say who you are and your affiliation, if you have one. Who would like to start off? Nyla.
I'm a PhD national. One of the questions, I'm not familiar with this work. I work on international development. So it's quite interesting to come and listen to what politics looks like in Britain, even though I live in Britain. But one of the things that I was thinking as you spoke is I can see in my mind something that I recognize as the white working class, you know, got it. So I think, you know, is there nothing called a black working class? Is it that black people are defined by their cultural identities, their religious identities, etc., but they have no class identity? Because when I think about the black working class, no image immediately enters my mind. You know, it's a much more heterogeneous, a much more diffuse set of people. And yet black people have been a part of the working class since they arrived. So I was quite interested in where that group fits into this.
Yeah. Do you want to ask that straight away or should we?
Yes, do you want to get a
couple more questions?
Not least because thinking time is always useful for good questions.
I know, absolutely. Any more questions now? Yeah, you shout there.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, like, how do you position left-wing populism, especially like the Green Party, like the success of like the Zach Polanski, like especially on the issue of like the economic grievances that you've discussed, like how can we position their like this picture? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, anyone another question or should we ask? Yeah.
I want to push back on the idea that white working class people, I completely agree that they don't always recognise themselves as white, they just think of themselves as working class. But actually, do they recognise themselves as working class? Because so much of the time, they don't know any different. And a lot of the like the tradespeople that are very successful in their own thing, like in my experience, they're worried that they're actually entering the top 5% and the tax for the super rich is going to affect them now. So how do you tell a story of like recognizing this group that they just know they're ordinary and they feel like, I don't know, working class, that comes into, you only recognize that when you like read Marx and read theory and you talk about it a lot, but I don't know if that many people in, say, Portsmouth, because that's where I'm from, sorry John, would recognize that.
Okay, very good question.
Yeah. Let me have a go at the third. Sam, do you want to do the third one? So I think your question is a very good one. Let's say two things about class. One is that one of the reasons we don't talk about a unified working class experience is actually because of geography, employment, location. That experience is not a lived reality in many parts of the world. In some cities it is, and in the precariat it is, in other places it isn't. And that's one of the areas that has fallen back over the last 20 years. When the riots happened in Burnley in 2001, and I was involved in the aftermath of that, one of the things that had changed in Burnley was that the big aerospace factories, which had been worked in by white working class people and British Pakistanis, had all closed. And at that time, you had a situation where even if people went back to a different part of the town or worshipped in a different building, they were all in the same trade union. They elected the best person as shop steward wherever they came from. Industrial change has actually eroded some of the places in which a unified working class experience is formed. That's the second point. Secondly, I think it is the case that actually that class language is not used as systematically as it should be about minority communities. And I think your criticism, you can end up to saying, well, they're defined by faith and ethnicity and they're defined by class. I think that is a good question to raise about the language. On left populism, I mean, I'm one of those who distinguishes between what I would call national populism, some people call radical right populism, and left populism. I think there are more differences than similarities in the way that they try to mobilize people. So I think that the Green Party is a particular phenomenon of left populism, but you'll find its equivalents in France and other places as well, and in Germany. At the moment, it seems to me that they are more successful at mobilizing a section of society, which, if you like, is already on the liberal, pluralist, diverse side of society. The real challenge, say, for the Green Party and our politics is, can they make the breakthrough politically on their economically left populist agenda to the sort of people we've been talking about tonight? And there may be an implicit assumption that they're going to find that more difficult than we find, but we will have to see. By the way, I don't, I am one of those who sees no particular reason why the Labour Party should not go the way of all the other great social democratic parties in Europe. I mean, there's nothing magic that sticks the Labour Party to the ceiling. So the political change that's happening in this country is not a uniquely British or English phenomenon. It's actually, you go across the Europe and look at what's happened to the social democratic parties that were active when I first joined the Labour Party. There are not many of them left. So there's nothing that says we stay with our same party structures. But I think the challenge, this is answering as interested in politics, the challenge for left populism is, can it actually break out of a relatively liberal, progressive section of society to a mass audience? We don't know the answer to that question yet. Sam, do you want to talk about working class?
Yeah. There's a few different ways to think about this. So tradespeople, as an example, is a very good one because most of them are doing pretty well for themselves. And I think this does have something to some extent to do with geography and legacy of place. So I don't know much about Portsmouth, unfortunately, but in kind of certain parts of the country, I think there is a legacy of being from that working class culture You know, that kind of legacy that is a family legacy as well as the legacy of place. So it's where your parents went to work, where your grandparents went to work. So even in those places, you could be doing quite well for yourself, but you're still embedded within those narratives. So that is your lived experience, or your parents, grandparents' lived experience. So you grow up in that and feel that you are working class, even if, you know, on the kind of economic scale, you probably don't fit into that kind of like narrow categorization. Think as well, thinking about who does or doesn't define themselves as working class, it is useful to acknowledge that class as a kind of frame of reference and as a frame for political recognition really did go out of fashion for a long time after the kind of political defeat of the working class, trade unions, closure of industries in the 1980s. So it is possible that, you know, over the course of 40 years, there are people that are also in a working class position, but maybe don't think of themselves as in a working class position because that isn't a way that they were able to be represented for a period of time. So it is a very complicated kind of identity in a lot of ways. And I think that's one thing that we've sort of tried to capture with a description of the white working class. It is, plus it's obviously an element, we've literally named it, but it's also to do with geography and all of those things as well.
Can I have a quick Portsmouth related point? Because, and I think we're suggesting that you go out and say, right, we are now going to talk to the white working class, precisely because the questions of recognition. A few years ago, I did some work about higher education participation in Hampshire. One of the places that stood out was Portsmouth. And I remember going to talk to people in Paulsgrove, you know, the Paulsgrove estate, which has a very low level of participation in higher education. One of the local councillors described it to me, John, it's the white van capital of the south of England. In other words, there's an entire culture based around not going to university, getting a trade, getting a van, setting yourself up. They would undoubtedly see themselves as part of the working class in what was, when I was doing the work, a predominantly white area. And our argument is more that you actually need, in politics or the state or whatever, to recognise that community as one that has a right to a voice, without necessarily labelling it or using the language of recognition.
So, Anand, do you want to say anything?
Maybe just one word on the left-wing populism.
Yeah.
From a party strategy point of view. I mean, one thing, sort of building on what I said about the exclusive part of the identity, the outgroup, is of course what they do quite clearly is they identify an outgroup. So it's not the same as right populism, where the outgroup are the immigrants mainly. But here the outgroup are, you know, we saw it in the recent Green win. So, there's appeal to the group, appeal to the working class, and then who is it who's bleeding us, the working class, not just white, but generally the working class dry. It's the rich people, it's the billionaires, the millionaires. It's very clear, you know, it's sort of textbook populism in that sense that you define this outgroup, and in a sense, it's the easy solution. Yeah. So for the right, it's, you know, if we got rid of the immigrants, deported them all, the NHS would work, everything would be, you know, the land of milk and honey, it'd be beautiful. But in a sense, the left populist parties do some of the same. Or if we just tax the billionaires, we all know that's super rich, it's super easy, we just tax them properly, again, it'll all be solved. So there is that kind of, so I fully agree, they're much more to differentiate than they have in common. I don't think sort of lumping them all together is useful. But I just think that kind of, I think that's what you've seen with the Green Party, with Zach Polanski, is they just adopt that very clear, you identify the outgroup and you just sort them out, and that solves everything else. And I think it's just sort of stuck. Now, of course, generally the left populists, if you look across Europe, have not been as successful as the right populists, and as you say, they haven't sort of necessarily managed to. But there is that sort of similarity in that you do know who the bad guys are.
Yeah, and there is a blurring as well, because many supposedly right populist parties, some of the most successful ones in the continent, put left-wing economic programs.
Yes.
And actually, one of the things that surprises me most about reform is how slow they have been to drift left on the economy.
Yeah.
I imagine they will do before the next election. But if you look at Wilders and his approach to young people and what he says about housing and things like that, canny populists combine the two. And just quickly on your point, you're absolutely spot on that we treat minorities as minorities and don't talk about them by their class. And actually, that makes even less sense now than it ever did before, because those communities no longer vote as ethnic blocks.
Yeah.
So if you take Indian Hindus now vote like white people used to vote, but no longer vote. That is to say, they vote by their class. If you've got a university degree and you're an Indian Hindu, you're more likely to vote Tory. But if you've got a university degree and you're white, you're more likely to vote Labour. So I think it just goes to how we oversimplify those groups and think of them as sort of blobs, whereas actually the reality is far more nuanced.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to respond to, thank you for your comments, Sara and Anand. I'd like to respond to one of the points that you led with, Sara, and which I think, Anand, you said you agreed with. And that is that a multiculturalist political strategy of giving some salience to identities is likely to fail for a centre-left party. And wouldn't it be better to just talk about public services and economic growth and so on? But these issues don't arise in a vacuum. We've already got a political context in which identities have a certain salience and in which minority, anti-racist and identity assertive politics has been one of the drivers for raising that salience, and which a kind of majoritarian identity assertion or majoritarian identity anxiety is partly a reaction. So we've already got that. So your strategy of saying, oh, whatever Labour should do, you should stay silent on issues of identity, because if it addresses them, it'll somehow be stoking up identity divisions or identity self-superiority. I think just the opposite. It has to address a political ferment, a political polarization, where identities are already salient and are dividing the country in exactly the ways that John mentioned, which make it more difficult for the country to get together, come together with a self-belief and a unity. So I take your point, Sara, that identities quite often, have a exclusionary element as well as saying something about oneself. We say, oh, but at least we're not like them. In fact, we're superior to them. In fact, we don't like them, and so on. But multiculturalism has always had to engage with that issue, because beginning with minority identities that are racialized, it's always about opposing the negative dimensions of identities, the othering, the racializing, and so on, and allowing the minorities to speak for themselves so that more positive and self-affirming identities can be expressed within a kind of egalitarian political project, egalitarian political culture. So it's not about, I don't know, Hindu supremacy or so on, but yes, we are Hindus and we're British and we belong here and we want to work with everybody else as long as we are fully recognized and accepted. And just a footnote in reply to your question, I mean, Anand to some extent touched on it, but I'll come from a slightly different angle to say that if we look at the historical context, so, 1960s, 70s, and 80s, standard mainstream socialists were against people emphasizing their racial identities, including to people who said there's a black working class that's not being addressed by simply talking about the working class. And actually, it wasn't just to do with race, it was also to do with gender. That if we just talk about working class, we're not addressing the position of women, both working class women and other women, and so on. So actually, again, this is the historical context that we've already begun to talk about identities which are either sitting alongside class, or fragmenting class, or sitting above class. So I don't think we've got to a point where, oh, why aren't we allowed to talk about the black working class, or not allowed to? Why don't we? Because such a thing exists as well. Because actually, at least in the academic literature, that argument has been making a lot of running against what you might call people who just emphasize class and don't qualify it by identity dimensions like gender and race, ethnicity, and so on.
You want to come back?
Yeah, I wasn't for a moment saying Labour should be silent on these issues. In fact, one of the most dispiriting things has been how reluctant the Prime Minister has been to sort of fight back at some of the appalling language we've heard increasingly over the last 6 or 12 months. My point was simply, I think Labour should worry if going into the next election, the most salient issue in our national conversation is immigration. It's not a question of sort of ignoring your principles or not speaking out when people say things that are obviously wrong. It's a question of, as the government, you have a degree of control the salience of issues when elections approach. And I'm not convinced for Labour having identity issues as being the most salient is very helpful.
I don't think it has to be the most salient, but I think you have to have a story about a nation.
I think
Otherwise you end up
to make it more extreme, so we have an argument.
Yeah. But otherwise you do end up, to be frank, where we are with Japan removed, who is sort of creating a situation where migration is absolutely identified as the reason undermining the coherence and cohesion of our society. That is a far worse position to be in.
No, and electorally.
Telling a story about national cohesion. And that what worries me is almost if Labour isn't trying to tell the sort of story that we are, you end up trying to tell the story that the Home Secretary is trying to tell, which I think actually makes things worse because it absolutely identifies the existence of minorities within our country who want to stay here as the root of our problem.
I mean, Labour's telling no story about anything.
No, but the implicit story of it, yes.
Let's have again to the audience.
Yes, thank you. I haven't read your paper, so I definitely take it with a pinch of salt. But I have actually been researching race and class for many years, and I think one thing I would say, I'm also from a white working class background, or maybe still currently. But I think it's important, obviously, to talk about class, to talk about the dimensions of class. I am a bit concerned to hear more about white working class in particular, because I think we have to acknowledge a bit the way that race is talked about in this country, which is often, as you were saying, about black and brown people or migrant communities, where class is not usually emphasized, and then whiteness is usually talked about in terms of class. So I think that's kind of the context that this discourse is kind of feeding into, and it is often weaponized. So I think, to me, it's more important to talk about class. I do think we need to talk about race, and we have done research on this. It's called the Race Class Narrative Project, and basically what we found was really useful is when we talk about working class issues, to say black or brown working class people or diverse working class people, and what that signaled to different audiences is that basically if you're white, when you heard that message, you knew that they were talking about you as well. But also if you're black and brown, the message is also talking to you. And we found that much more effective than just talking about white, not talking about race whatsoever, which was kind of the strategy maybe of a few years ago, because essentially we do need to be pushing back on some of these divisive narratives. So I just wanted to kind of, put that out there, and also ask a question about the white middle class, because I think, again, if we're going to talk about white identity or kind of national identity and who's represented and who's not, I think part of the conversation we don't have is around, white middle class people and their role in things.
Thank you. Another question? What's happening now? At the back there,
What are the most appropriate designs and methods in researching this topic, and why? And is there perhaps an argument to use tools like interviews more critically to challenge participants' views about identity and class in the spirit of creating new knowledge in this area?
Okay, one more question. Yeah.
Following the line of argument about people acknowledging themselves to be a part of the white working class, to what extent does that acknowledgement overshadow other parts of people's identity, such as their sexuality and, as briefly touched upon, their gender?
Okay. Oh.
Let's have a go. Firstly, your research sounds really interesting, and I'll link that to the second question too, if I can, in this sense. This is you read the paper, it's a theoretical paper. It's based on extending a theory of multiculturalism and Tarek's work with multicultural nationalism to recognise that those things which have often existed, at least in public debate, not in academia, as the assumption of a white hegemonic majority, which if you're white, you're part of the hegemonic majority and that's an end of it, and then you're a minority, that doesn't work so well as Sam was working earlier when you have a fragmentation of that. And so we were asking ourselves the question, what's the position of the white working class in that fragmented position? That sort of work, to me, because of my political background, gets to the point that most academic research should get to, which is, now that I know that, what do I do about it? And what we're most interested in doing about this project now is actually the practical work that says, what is the language you use? What is the context in which you do stuff? What would I, if I went back to being an MP, do differently today as a member of parliament in a working class former industrial constituency to what I did 10 years ago? And I think that we are really interested and are actively working to find partners to actually do that sort of practical work. And therefore, understanding which language works, which language doesn't work is crucially important. And the question, I can't remember who asked the question about research methodology, it's in that same sort of area. You get to a stage where you've actually got to go out and try some of this stuff, actually on a small scale, to work out its impact. So that face-to-face engagement with people about language and political practice, I think is crucial. Otherwise, it's just a nice article in Political Quarterly. Doesn't make any difference. And I suppose, I won't ask the rest of it. Sam, do you want to add something to that? Middle class? Or...
I mean, I was more thinking, like touching on gender, for example. I think in this sense, we haven't got it in this article, but elsewhere, I think gender and class, of course, there's plenty of research that links the two. And I mean, it's still as salient as ever. Something like, for example, care work is hugely overrepresented in gender terms. Most of the people that do care work are women, and it's also one of the most precarious areas, places to work in, the predominance of 0 hours contracts, quite poor work-life balance, limited kind of protections, all those kinds of things. There's definitely a gender dimension to it, and we would absolutely acknowledge that. I think it's just that we are looking at the white working class in a sense because that's what has come to the forefront and is pushed by a lot of right-wing populists at the moment.
Perhaps I can ask a question from the floor, which actually will also go to Sara and Anand. But it is one of the things which I find really fantastic about your paper is you are talking about the working class. And someone who has done lots of interviews, you ask about research methodologies, and the experience of doing qualitative interviews in the UK is class is everywhere in the interviews, but often not overtly.
Yes.
And it's kind of surfacing how we talk about class, which is there, but somehow it escapes direct focus. Because Sara, when you were saying that the Labour Party's way of dealing with that is to talk about the working people.
Yeah.
And hence they combine your two groups, the middle class academics and doctors with factory workers and that thing. But of course that has failed, that doesn't have that kind of visceral appeal the language of the working class does. And one of the very odd things about the UK, comparatively, is that in many countries, if you ask people what class do you belong to, people say I'm a middle class, because that's saying I'm not neither elite nor am I at the bottom struggling. I'm somewhere in the middle. But in the UK, the working class has this kind of romantic almost appeal about I'm an ordinary person. I have no special privileges, and that also captures something about I'm a central player in this. I have really important views I need to be taken into account. And so I do think, I'm not sure about the reasons we've been discussing, whether it's useful to have white in front of it, I'm not sure of that. But the working class, bringing that into the debate and recognising that that working class is racialised is, I think, really important. And so I do think that's significant. That's more perhaps of a comment.
A brief response to that, which is where I ended up, in a sense. Part of the critique of our approach is that it's a divisive approach, and that if you recognise the white working class, that automatically means you're against some sort of class solidarity that cuts across different groups. We at least speculate that if you do what we're suggesting, you also create better conditions for a unified working class response.
Yeah.
However, that obviously means going beyond what we're talking about in the paper, because if governments don't want to give any part of the working class agency and greater power to influence their own lives, you don't get anywhere at all, really. So implicit in this is that you're doing this, but you're also recognising that you cannot address issues faced by any working class people by governments paternalistically delivering for them. You have to do it so that people have agency to shape things for people themselves. So that is possibly another article, but we in our own discussions would say that as actually at the end of the day, we think you've got a greater chance of a unified working class response if you take this approach than if you don't. Others will have a different view, but that's our thinking anyway, Mike, on that question.
So I think Anand, you making that need to focus on material issues, welfare state, economic growth, and these things. Do you think the language of class helps the Labour Party do that, or do you think that's distraction?
I mean, the reason, of course, that they went away from it, I mean, I always sort of love looking at old posters. Yeah. It's not just the language. Now, if you look at old Labour Party posters, I mean, you had sort of good working class, white working class scrabbling lad there. Everyone knew that's was who they were representing, and there was sort of a pride in that. But of course, there was a reason for why they went away from it, and it was because, both in absolute terms and in relative terms, that groups would no longer make up an electoral winning coalition for Labour. So, I mean, So the problem Labour is facing, and of course that was, I guess, part of the sort of new Labour strategy, was to say, even if they were able to, to appeal to get all the votes from all the white working class, that wouldn't make a winning coalition. I mean, and also now if we look at the people who vote, I mean, of course there's not a lot if you trust opinion polls right now, but who vote for Labour, they don't have a very significant working class advantage in that. So in a sense, the electoral coalition that's been growing with Labour is successful are, professional, highly educated, more urban voters, particularly public sector voters who see an advantage in having. I mean, they're the people in addition to, not particularly white actually, but in addition to working class voters. And that is so I think it's important to talk about class, but we also have to recognize that Labour, if they want to in whether it's PR, but also in our electoral system, they're not going to win the votes if they and that's why they talk about working people. I don't think it really works, but if they were to talk about working class, there's also, then a lot of people be like, well, they don't represent me, and they're exactly the kind of people who would otherwise probably want to vote Labour and have been when Labour is successful voting it. So there is just the sheer fact of how, post-industrial society has changed in a way that it's just not how it was 100 years ago, that was a big enough coalition. So in that sense, Labour has to figure out how to have an electoral coalition that's winning, that's not just a working class vote if they want to be, plurality party.
I mean, it's a really strange thing about the Labour Party, because they just sometimes give the impression of really hating the people who vote for them.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're determined to sort of, the way they talk about universities or professional people.
Yeah.
And, there is that attachment amongst them. You know, a Labour MP said to me about 6 months ago, I'd rather lose an election than win one without working class votes. So there is that sort of emotional attachment. I think the language you use is fascinating. I mean, working people, as Labour use it, means a different group of people to what Theresa May meant when she said hardworking. They're different. You know they are. I mean, if you're British and you're attuned to these sort of class subtleties, they're different.
Hardworking people.
Well, the hardworking people are not professional middle class people, would be my guess on the Theresa May.
We're not hardworking enough.
Nigel Farage now has alarm clock Britain, which is another way of segmenting it. But actually, this takes me back to your question about the middle class, because the middle class are really interesting. So we have, you know, one of the myths of British politics over the last 10 years is it was the working class who caused Brexit. It's nonsense. It was the middle class who caused Brexit. The vast majority of Brexit goes to the middle class. But what that speaks to, I think, is there is a significant level of economic insecurity among middle class people. And actually, one of the great sort of, you know, if you look at the work of Jane Green, collaborators on economic insecurity, that is a fundamental driver of voter choice now, as much as if not more than that. It's how confident you feel about your future and your kids' future. And that is slightly divorced from the material circumstances in which you find yourself in, which leads to these really bizarre political coalitions like the Trump coalition in the US or like the Brexit coalition here. And one of the side effects of those weird coalitions, as Sara was talking about, is if you put together this sort of cross-class coalition, you then discover to your horror it's impossible to formulate economic policies that will keep them all happy because their interests are directly sort of contradicting each other. So there's really interesting shifts happening, I think. That's what it's.
Could I ask a question? Couple of times, both of you, Sara and Anand, have said you give extra saliency to immigration. I mean, this would be electorally a disastrous strategy for Labour. But it's interesting that you started talking about immigration from a very early point in your presentations, because in multicultural nationalism, immigration wasn't even mentioned. Why are you talking about immigration? We're talking about our country, the kind of country we want to be. We're not talking about a particular policy area like immigration. And if we just look at the academic literature, no one theorizing about multiculturalism is talking about immigration. There are theorists of immigration, or migration as they call it, but they're not usually multiculturalists. Sometimes they're anti-multiculturalists. They're usually sort of more cosmopolitans or internationalists, they might say, I don't know. And migration now is one of the largest areas of social studies in Britain. Certainly, if you look at the British Sociological Association, it's very large, but most of them are multiculturalists. So why, I mean, we've got these two different autonomous areas of thinking and policy direction. One's about thinking about our country as a multicultural country, and the other's about formulating immigration policy. Why must they be tangled together?
Well, I think you're right. I think in conceptual terms, you're quite right. I mean, I'm sort of programmed to think in the way that politics happens, and the two debates are in daily politics as opposed to in political science. I think the two are inextricably linked. I think how you think about immigration is tied to what you think about the nature of society we live in, and I think the way you think about the nature of society we live in is tied to your view of whether we are being flooded by immigrants or not. So, I mean, that's just the environment I inhabit now, with people talking in terms of policy and politics rather. But you're absolutely right. In conceptual terms, they're separate.
And if you look at the attitude structures and you ask people questions of, you know, whether multiculturalism is a good thing or bad thing and how that correlates with what people think about migration, they're very, very highly correlated. Now, I think you're right. And I'd say also, I think something that Labour misses, that part of multiculturalism to work well is about integration of immigrants who have come here at some point. And I think a lot of concerns about the people who say they're concerned about immigration, they're not necessarily, I mean, that's in my view, as concerned about immigration as poorly integrated immigrants. Yeah, so there are lots of immigrants that are perfectly fine because they are well integrated, and that's when multiculturalism works well. When it, in terms of the kind of grievances they have, is often when there is multiculturalism where integration has not worked. But then if you look at Labour's policy, for example, all the political science literature shows that some of the factors that makes integration work better are, for example, policies of granting immigrants like myself citizenship. So you feel you have a stake. Now I have brought up 3 completely British English kids that think they're nothing other than English. I don't think other people will notice that they're not, but partly because there were policies in place that allowed that integration. But of course, what Labour does with its policies that are partly a response to some of these preferences is make those kind of institutions for integration work. So I do think they're conceptually distinct, and you're right. But the reason is, if you put in a survey question multiculturalism, for most people, that would be about immigration, because how does multiculturalism historically and even today come about? It comes about through immigration.
Just to add that, because I agree, it makes no sense at all to continually extend the period of time before people can settle. It's the worst possible thing to do. It's also true of some of the other things that are done. Local cohesion strategy is, again, it's talking about people acquiring the language, people needing to work. That's fine. What's the language you use about that? If you talk about it one way, you're projecting messages. The trouble with these people is they come here, they won't learn the language, and they're not prepared to work. Or if you tell the story in terms of people who come here want to be part of society and want to work, so we're going to enable that to happen, that's a completely different story. And very often, politics opts for the former story that says these people are the problem by definition. And actually, just adding to your thing about the impact of immigration, it's all contextual. And in my constituency, the thing that really pushed UKIP's vote up dramatically was an influx of white Christians, because it was the AA's expansion. So it was Poles and the other groups from Eastern Europe. It was not people of race at all. It was just, but there was a massive social impact, massive housing impact, massive public service impact. So there are questions about rate of change, management and things of that sort. But I sort of do come back to this point that you have to have a story about how your society is going to work. And that story about your society has got to enable each group to say, that's a story in which I have a voice and a stake. Now, if there are groups that say, well, I'm not satisfied with any story that doesn't make me top dog, some of the people you were talking about earlier, you can't include them within the story. But I am optimistic enough to say that we can tell a story about the nation in which the great majority of people can say, I can see that I've got a voice, I've got a stake, I've got recognition in that. And underlying this, we're trying to say, well, how do you tell that story? There's lots of questions we haven't answered, and I acknowledge the one about language we use and things of that sort. But that's really the aim of the exercise. And I think it's necessary. Whether you foreground it, it ought to be part of it. It does my historical point. Multiculturalism was abandoned as an official state policy in 2011. Since multiculturalism drifts on as a practice, it is not being advocated by any government. We're now in 2026, and the latest community cohesion strategy by the government still does not assert a story of what the nation should be like. That's an appalling dereliction of duty by the state.
I think that's a really strong and interesting statement to finish on.
Greatly.
Is there anyone else on the panel that says anything to finish on? Or no? No, it's a bit of debate. It's really important we're having discussions about class, race, and right-wing populism and whatever, and all the different things we have to deal with. So thanks so much for the panel, to Anand and Anand and Sara and Harry and all of you for coming. Hope you'll be entertained, and hope to see you again here soon. Thank you.